Please follow me," the little black girl told the biker as heavy engines rumbled beneath the loading deck. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get into today's story. The sun had set hours ago, and the carnival was still buzzing with energy. The sounds of children's laughter mixed with the deep rumble of motorcycle engines and the faint smell of kettle corn hanging in the air. But that normal, fun-filled atmosphere was about to be shattered by an urgent cry for help. A little black girl, no older than 8, sprinted through the crowd, her feet barely touching the ground as she pushed past families and vendors, eyes wide with fear. Her clothes were torn, her braids wild and tangled, and tears streamed down her face as she ran toward the group of bikers who were enjoying a quiet moment by their booth. "Please follow me home," she cried out, her voice trembling with fear. The bikers, who were used to the sounds of revving engines and the occasional brawl, froze as they saw her approach. Jack, the leader of the group, was the first to step forward, his brow furrowed in confusion. He had seen many things in his life, but a frightened little girl running to them in the middle of a carnival? That was something new. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" Jack asked, his voice calm but firm as he knelt down to her level. The other bikers, a group of tough men and women, exchanged concerned glances, unsure what to do next. The girl's breathing was shallow as she looked up at Jack, her eyes wide and filled with desperation. "They took my brother," she stammered. "They put him in a van and drove away. I tried to stop them, but Her words trailed off as the terror took over, and she began to sob uncontrollably. Jack's heart clenched at the sight of her fear. He exchanged a look with Bear, the largest of the group, and, without a word, Bear sprang into action. "Where did they go?" Jack asked, his voice sharp, his instincts kicking in. The girl pointed a trembling finger toward the far side of the parking lot. "That way," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of the carnival's fading music. They had a silver van. It had a skull sticker on the back. Jack's eyes narrowed. The skull sticker was a familiar symbol, a gang known as the Serpents, a group they had crossed paths with before. The memory sent a cold shiver down his spine. These were not the kind of people you wanted to deal with, but they didn't have a choice. Jack stood up and turned to the group. "Let's go," he said, his voice firm with determination. "We're not letting those bastards get away with this." The bikers, though tired from the day's charity work, didn't hesitate. They immediately began to prepare, starting their engines with a roar that echoed through the night. "We'll take care of this," Bear said, his voice steady as he mounted his bike. "No one messes with a kid. Not while we're here." The group revved their engines and tore off into the night, leaving behind the quiet, festive scene of the carnival. The chase was on. The roar of the engines was deafening as the bikers sped down the darkened highway, their headlights slicing through the night. The wind whipped past them, the chill of the evening air stinging their faces as they followed the girl's directions. Jack was at the front, his eyes scanning the road ahead, every muscle in his body tense with anticipation. His mind raced, thinking about the little girl and her brother. What kind of people would take a child? The Serpents, Jack thought. They had a reputation for cruelty, and if they were involved, this wouldn't end well. Bear, the massive biker with a scarred face, rode beside him. "You sure about this, Jack?" he shouted over the roar of the engines. Jack didn't look at him, his eyes fixed on the road. "We've got no choice," he said. "That kid needs us." Behind them, the rest of the crew followed in perfect formation. Each of the bikers had their own reasons for joining the club, their own past that made them tough and uncompromising. But none of them hesitated. Not now. The road stretched out before them, empty and desolate, as they sped toward the outskirts of town. The girl had been clear. The van had headed in this direction, and they couldn't afford to lose sight of it. The minutes dragged by, each one heavier than the last. Jack's mind wandered back to the girl's face, the terror in her eyes, the desperation in her voice. She had no one else. That thought burned in his mind. The girl was a part of their world now, whether she knew it or not. They couldn't let her down. As they reached the outskirts of the town, the road became more treacherous. The lights from the nearby street lamps cast long shadows across the cracked asphalt, and a faint outline of old warehouses loomed in the distance. Jack's instincts told him they were close. He signaled to the others, and the group slowed, their engines now a low growl as they crept forward. "Keep your eyes open," Jack said into his radio. "We're getting close." The bike's headlights illuminated a faint outline of a silver van ahead, parked in a secluded area near a dilapidated warehouse. The bikers immediately spread out, taking their positions. Jack and Bear led the charge, their bikes cutting through the dark, while the others formed a perimeter around the area. Jack could feel his heart pounding in his chest as they neared the van. The girl's words echoed in his mind. They put him in a silver car. They couldn't be too late. As they approached, Jack's hand rested on the handle of his knife. There was no telling what they'd find when they got there, but he wasn't about to let these bastards get away with it. The van was eerily silent, the only sound the hum of the motorcycles as they parked in a tight circle around it. Jack dismounted his bike slowly, keeping his movements calm and measured. The others followed suit, stepping off their bikes and spreading out, their eyes scanning the area. The tension was palpable. Jack signaled Bear to stay close as they approached the van. "You see anyone?" Jack asked in a low voice. Bear shook his head, his massive frame barely moving in the darkness. "Not yet, but they're here. I can feel it." Jack nodded and approached the van, his hand gripping the cold metal of the door. He pulled it open slowly, his heart racing. Inside, the van was empty. His eyes darted around the interior, looking for any sign of the boy. But there was nothing. He cursed under his breath. "They must have moved him," Jack muttered. "We're too late." Bear's eyes narrowed. "Not necessarily. There's something off about this place." Jack turned to face him. "What do you mean?" Bear pointed toward the far side of the warehouse, where a faint light glowed from an open door. Jack's heart skipped a beat. "That's where they are. They've got him in there." Without a word, the bikers moved into action. Jack led the way, his boots pounding on the dirt ground as they approached the building. The door creaked open, revealing a dark hallway. They moved quickly, staying low and quiet, their senses on high alert. Every step brought them closer to the unknown. Jack's mind raced as he thought about the boy. "Where are you, kid?" The hallway ended in a large room, dimly lit by a single hanging light bulb. In the center of the room, a figure stood, his back to them. Jack's hand went to his knife. "Drop it," Jack commanded, his voice steady. The figure froze, then slowly turned around, revealing a man with a cold, calculating look in his eyes. The man's gaze flickered to the bikers and then back to Jack. "You don't know what you're getting into," the man sneered. Jack's grip tightened on his knife. "I know exactly what I'm getting into. You've hurt a kid, and that's something we don't take lightly." The man laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You think you can stop us? You're nothing but a bunch of outlaws. The law doesn't care about you." Jack stepped forward, his voice low and dangerous. "The law might not care, but we do, and you'll regret crossing us." The man's smirk faltered as Jack's crew moved into the room, forming a circle around him. The biker gang wasn't just about motorcycles. They were about loyalty, about protecting the helpless. Jack's eyes locked on a man's, and he could feel the weight of his words settle in the room. "Now, where's the kid?" The man stood in front of Jack, his cold eyes not showing a trace of fear. Jack's hand tightened around the hilt of his knife as he stepped closer. "You got a lot of nerve," Jack growled, his voice low and dangerous. "But this ends tonight." The man laughed again, his tone mocking. "You think you can intimidate me? This is just the beginning. You don't know what's coming." Jack narrowed his eyes. "I've seen enough. I'm not leaving here without that kid." The man sneered, his eyes flickering to the corner of the room. "You want him? He's right there." Jack's heart skipped a beat as his eyes followed the man's gaze. There, in the corner, bound to a chair, was a small boy. His eyes were wide with fear, his face pale, but the relief in his gaze when he saw the bikers was unmistakable. Jack's stomach twisted as he saw the boy's bruised and bloodied arms. Without thinking, he rushed over to the child, pulling a knife from his belt to cut the ropes that held him in place. The boy winced as the ropes came free, his arms shaking as he struggled to stand. "You're safe now," Jack whispered, kneeling beside him. The boy's eyes filled with tears as he looked up at Jack. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Jack placed a hand on his shoulder, offering what little comfort he could. Behind him, Bear and the other bikers had surrounded the man, their hands ready at their sides, their eyes locked on him. Jack looked over his shoulder at the man, his face hard as stone. "You're done," Jack said, his voice cold. "You're not going anywhere. The police will be here soon, and they'll deal with you." The man scoffed. "The police? They can't stop us. We got connections. You're nothing." Jack's eyes burned with fury. "You're nothing but a coward who uses kids as pawns. You'll pay for this." The man opened his mouth to say something, but Jack didn't give him a chance. "Get him out of here," Jack said to Bear, nodding toward the door. Bear stepped forward and grabbed the man's arm, pulling him roughly toward the exit. The man didn't resist, knowing he was beaten. The bikers didn't even look at him as they moved out of the way, the tension still hanging heavy in the air. With the boy safe, Jack turned his attention back to the child in his arms. "What's your name, kid?" he asked gently. "Jamal," the boy whispered, his voice trembling. "Jamal, you're going to be okay. We're going to get you home." Jamal nodded slowly, his tears still falling, but now a glimmer of hope shone in his eyes. The bikers moved quickly, their job done for the moment. But Jack couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. He knew the Serpents wouldn't let this go so easily. As the group of bikers escorted Jamal out of the warehouse, the tension still hung in the air. It felt like the calm before the storm. Jack could feel it in his gut. This wasn't just about rescuing a child. This was personal. He didn't know what had drawn the Serpents into this fight, but he was certain of one thing. The battle was far from over. As they reached the parking lot, the sound of sirens grew louder in the distance. Jack took a deep breath, his gaze focused on the horizon. "We got to get him out of here." "Fast," Jack said. Bear nodded. "We'll ride out. Keep low." Jack glanced at the boy in his arms, his heart heavy with the weight of what they'd just pulled off. They couldn't let their guard down. Not yet. As the bikers mounted their bikes, the engines roared to life again, filling the night air with their thunderous sound. The convoy, now with Jamal safely in their midst, headed out into the night. Jack's mind was focused, his eyes scanning the road ahead. But deep down, he knew the Serpents wouldn't stop coming. And this time, there was no going back. The roar of the engines echoed in the night as Jack and the bikers pushed forward, their headlights cutting through the darkness. Jamal sat in front of Jack on the bike, his small body trembling but grateful for the protection. The convoy moved in a tight formation, their leather jackets glinting in the light from the headlights as they made their way through the winding roads. Jack's mind raced with thoughts of the kidnapper, the Serpents, and what was coming next. They had gotten Jamal out, but Jack knew that would only be the beginning. He could feel the weight of the promise he'd made to Tyrone, a promise to protect his daughter, and now Jamal was part of that responsibility. As they drove on, Jack's radio crackled. "Boss, we're getting reports of movement up ahead." Bear's voice came through, sounding calm but urgent. "Looks like we've got company." Jack's grip tightened on the handlebars, his stomach sinking. "How many?" "Hard to say," Bear replied. "But they're coming fast. We'll need to keep a sharp eye out." Jack's mind flashed to the Serpents. They were ruthless, always unpredictable. If they were coming for Jamal, there would be no mercy. "Keep tight, everyone," Jack called out over the radio. "We're not giving them an inch. No one gets through us." The convoy sped up, the sound of their bikes blending into one powerful force. Jack's eyes scanned the road ahead, every instinct on high alert. The last thing they needed was an ambush. "Jamal, you doing okay back there?" Jack asked, his voice softer now. The boy nodded, though his body was still tense. "I'm fine. Just scared." Jack glanced back at the boy, his heart heavy. "I know, kid, but we're not stopping until you're safe. I promised your dad, and I don't break my promises." They rode on in silence for a few moments, but the tension was thick. Jamal clung to Jack, still processing everything that had happened. He had been taken from his home, separated from his family, and now he was riding with a group of strangers, hoping for safety. Jack's mind kept turning over the details of the night, how the Serpents had targeted the boy, the suddenness of the abduction, and how they had moved fast to get him out. It wasn't over yet. In the distance, the flickering lights of a small town came into view. Jack's heart rate quickened as they neared, knowing that the Serpents wouldn't be far behind. "Stay sharp," Jack muttered to himself, the convoy slowing as they approached the edge of the town. He glanced back to make sure everyone was in position. "We make it through here, we get to the safe house. Stick together." The town's main street was quiet, the shops and houses bathed in the pale glow of streetlights. But there was something unsettling about the calm. "This is it," Jack said quietly. "Keep your eyes peeled. They could be anywhere." As they turned the corner, Jack's eyes locked onto something in the distance. Movement. A black van was parked near the side of the road, its engine running. Jack's heart skipped a beat. It was too quiet, too perfect. This was exactly what the Serpents would do. Lay in wait, draw them in, and spring the trap. "Everybody down," Jack shouted, signaling for the group to take cover. In an instant, the bikers scattered, their movements swift and precise. Jack's mind was racing as he dismounted his bike, pulling his weapon from his belt. His eyes never left the van, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. The van's door creaked open, and two figures stepped out, their faces masked. Jack's hand gripped his knife tightly as he moved behind the nearest building, signaling for Bear to follow. "Stay low, keep the pressure on," Jack muttered. Bear nodded, his eyes scanning the area. "I'll take left. You go right. We'll corner them." Jack nodded and moved quickly, his boots light on the pavement. His heart was pounding, his breath steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. As he rounded the corner of the building, Jack saw one of the masked figures in his sights. He didn't hesitate. "Freeze!" Jack yelled, his voice like a whip cracking through the silence. The figure spun around, eyes wide, but it was too late. Jack was on him in seconds, his knife flashing in the moonlight as he disarmed the man with a swift, calculated move. The man stumbled back, eyes wide with shock. "Where's the kid?" Jack growled, his voice low and threatening. The man's lips curled into a sneer. "You'll never find him. The Serpents always get what they want." Jack's hand tightened around his knife. "Not this time. Not on my watch." He stepped closer, his face inches from the man's. "You don't know who you're dealing with." The man's smirk faded as he realized just how outmatched he was. "You think you've won? You think you can just walk away from this?" Jack pressed harder, his voice low and cold. "You're done. This ends tonight." The figure's eyes flickered to the ground, defeated. Jack didn't take his eyes off him as he spoke into his radio. "Bear, get over here. We've got one. And we're not done yet." Jack moved in for the next step, knowing that the battle was just beginning. The sound of sirens echoed in the distance as Jack and the crew waited in the shadows, the tension thick in the air. The van, now immobilized and its occupants secured, had been their first target, but the real battle was just beginning. Jack's mind raced as he watched Bear and the other bikers move the captured man into a secure spot, out of sight. The streets were quiet, but Jack knew that the Serpents weren't the kind of people to back down easily. This was more than a rescue. It was about sending a message. Jack looked down at Jamal, who was still clinging to him, wide-eyed and nervous. "You're safe, kid. We're almost there," Jack reassured him, his voice calm despite the chaos swirling around them. Jamal nodded slowly, though fear still clouded his eyes. He didn't speak, but Jack could feel the weight of his silence. "Stay close, all right?" Jack added, his protective instincts kicking in. Bear came over, his presence a reassuring force. "We've got him contained, but they'll come for us," Bear said quietly, looking around cautiously. Jack nodded. "We'll be ready. We're not running." The plan was simple: get Jamal to safety and wait for the police to arrive, but Jack knew that wasn't going to be easy. The Serpents were a notorious gang, known for their ruthless tactics and willingness to do anything to get what they wanted. The bikers, though, were more than just a gang. They were a family, and no one messed with their family. Jack turned to his crew. "We're holding this ground until the cops get here. No one leaves this place until we're sure they're safe." The bikers nodded in agreement, each of them positioning themselves strategically around the area, ready for whatever came next. The silence was heavy, broken only by the occasional crackle of a radio or the rumble of a distant engine. Time seemed to stretch on as they waited, each biker alert and ready for action. Jack's thoughts kept drifting to Tyrone, his old friend who had saved his life in combat. The promise he had made to Tyrone's daughter was one he wouldn't break, no matter what. He had promised to keep her safe, and that promise didn't end with just a van and a few bad men. It meant protecting her from whatever else the world might throw at them. As the minutes passed, the tension only grew. Then, without warning, the sound of motorcycles reached their ears, growing louder with each passing second. "They're here," Bear said, his voice low. Jack's grip tightened on his weapon as he prepared for whatever was coming. A moment later, the first bike appeared, followed by dozens more, all roaring toward them in a single, unified wave. The Serpents had arrived, and they weren't coming to talk. "Get ready," Jack called out to his crew, his voice steady. "We fight together." The bikes circled around the area, a show of force that made the hair on the back of Jack's neck stand on end. The Serpents had their own kind of power, their own brutal strength, but the Thunderwolves had something they didn't: loyalty and purpose. The leader of the Serpents, a tall, menacing figure with a skull tattoo on his neck, stepped forward, his gaze cold and calculating. "You really think you could just take what's ours?" he sneered, his voice thick with contempt. Jack took a step forward, meeting the man's cold gaze without flinching. "What's yours?" Jack asked, his voice laced with menace. "A kid? A family? You have no idea what loyalty means." The Serpent leader's lips curled into a cruel smile. "You're out of your league, biker. This doesn't end well for you." Jack didn't move, didn't blink. "It ends when we say it does." The leader's smile faded, his eyes narrowing. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But you don't have the firepower to back it up." "Maybe," Jack said, his voice steady. "But we've got something you don't: each other. And that's more than enough." Without warning, the Serpent leader lunged forward, his fist swinging in a deadly arc toward Jack's face. But Jack was ready. He ducked and countered with a swift blow to the man's ribs, knocking the wind out of him. The Serpent staggered back, growling in pain, but before he could recover, Bear was on him, grabbing him by the collar and slamming him into the ground. The rest of the Serpents watched, their eyes filled with anger, but they didn't move. "Not yet. We don't want trouble," Jack said, his voice cold as he stepped over the leader, who was now on the ground, struggling to breathe. "But we'll give it to you if that's what you want." The standoff lasted for what felt like an eternity, the tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. But then, just as quickly as it had started, the Serpent leader raised his hand, signaling his men to stand down. "This isn't over," he spat, his voice hoarse. "You haven't seen the last of us." Jack didn't flinch. "We'll be ready. You know where to find us." The Serpents didn't say another word as they turned and walked back to their bikes, their engines roaring to life as they disappeared into the night. Jack stood there, watching them go, his heart still racing. It wasn't over, but for now they had won. Jamal was safe, and that was all that mattered. Jack turned to Bear, who gave him a brief nod. "We did good," Bear said quietly. Jack smiled, but it was a tired smile. "We'll keep doing good. That's what we do." As they mounted their bikes and prepared to leave, Jack couldn't help but feel a strange sense of peace. It had been a long night, but they had come through it together. And as long as they had each other, they could face anything. The Thunderwolves were a family, and that meant everything. The sun was beginning to rise as the Thunderwolves rode through the quiet streets, their bikes cutting through the stillness of the early morning. Jack's mind was still racing from the events of the night before. The fight with the Serpents was only a temporary victory. He knew the gang would regroup, and it wouldn't be long before they came looking for payback. But for now, the immediate threat had been neutralized. Jamal was safe, and that was all that mattered. As they approached the safe house, Jack glanced at Jamal, who was riding quietly in front of him. The boy had been through so much in the past 24 hours, abducted, scared, and separated from his family. But he hadn't said much. Jack understood. The trauma was still fresh. They rode in silence for a few more minutes, the low rumble of the engines the only sound between them. Finally, Jack pulled up to the safe house, a small, inconspicuous building on the edge of town, hidden away from prying eyes. They parked their bikes, and the crew dismounted, stretching their stiff muscles after the long ride. Jamal slid off the bike carefully, his legs unsteady. Jack caught him before he could stumble. "Take it easy, kid," Jack said gently, his voice softer now. "You're safe here." Jamal looked up at him, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and fear. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice still shaky. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Jack placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to thank me. I made a promise to your dad. I'm keeping it." As they walked toward the door, Jack felt a weight lift from his chest. They had made it, but the job wasn't done. They had to keep Jamal safe, and that meant staying one step ahead of the Serpents. Inside the safe house, the group gathered in the living room. Bear was the first to speak. "We need to lay low for a while. The Serpents won't stop, and we can't afford to let our guard down." Jack nodded in agreement. "We'll keep Jamal here until we can figure out our next move. No one gets in without my say-so." The room fell silent for a moment as everyone took in the gravity of the situation. "We can't just sit here waiting for them to come to us," one of the bikers, Phantom, said. "We need to strike first." "Not yet," Jack replied, his voice firm. "We need to be smart about this. The Serpents are dangerous. We can't just go charging in without a plan." Bear crossed his arms. "You're right, but we can't let them think they have the upper hand. They'll keep coming after us if we don't show them we're not afraid." Jack sighed, rubbing his temples. "I get it, Bear, but we need to make sure Jamal is safe first. Once we've got that, then we'll plan our next move." The tension in the room was palpable, but everyone seemed to understand Jack's decision. For now, keeping Jamal safe was the top priority. As the group settled in, Jack found a quiet corner of the room and pulled out his phone. He needed to contact the authorities, but he wasn't sure who he could trust. The police were always a risk in these situations, and the last thing he needed was to tip off the Serpents. As he scrolled through his contacts, Jack's mind wandered back to the conversation with Tyrone before his friend had passed. Tyrone had known how dangerous the world they lived in was, but he had never once wavered in his commitment to protect his family. Jack had promised to watch over Tyrone's daughter, and he had promised to keep Jamal safe. Those promises weighed heavily on him now. He thought about the boy, and how scared he must have been, abducted in the dead of night, held hostage by a gang of criminals, not knowing if anyone would come to save him. Jack's thoughts were interrupted when Bear walked over, his expression serious. "We've got a problem," Bear said quietly. "One of the bikers just heard something on the scanner. The Serpents are gearing up for something big. They're not done with us." Jack's stomach churned. He had expected retaliation, but this sounded different. The Serpents were planning something more than just a few random attacks. "How soon?" Jack asked. "They're moving fast," Bear replied. "We don't have much time." Jack stood up, his mind already working on a plan. "We'll need to move Jamal again. This place isn't safe anymore." "Where are we going?" Bear asked. Jack looked around the room, his eyes meeting each of his crew members. "We take him to the compound. We got enough firepower there to hold them off." The decision was made quickly. They didn't have time to waste. Jack gathered his gear, making sure everyone was ready to go. "We keep Jamal in the center. He stays with me, and no one lets their guard down. We don't know what the Serpents are planning, but we'll be ready for whatever comes our way." The bikers quickly mounted their bikes, ready to head out. Jack watched as Jamal climbed onto his bike, this time holding on a little more confidently. The road ahead was uncertain, but Jack was determined. He wouldn't let anything happen to this boy, not while he still had breath in his body. The engines roared to life once again, and the convoy took off, heading toward the compound. Jack's mind was focused, the weight of the responsibility he had taken on settling heavily on his shoulders. He had promised to protect Tyrone's family, and he would keep that promise, no matter the cost. The Serpents were coming, but they were about to find out that the Thunderwolves were ready for them. The sound of roaring engines filled the air as Jack and his crew sped down the highway, their bikes cutting through the early morning fog. The convoy was tight, with Jack at the front and Jamal riding just behind him. The boy was quieter now, but his grip on the bike had tightened as they traveled, a sign that he was starting to feel the weight of everything that had happened. Jack stole a glance back at him, his face hard but determined. They were headed to the compound, a place that had served as a safe haven for the Thunderwolves in the past. But now, it felt more like a battleground. The Serpents weren't just some gang they could easily brush off. They were relentless, and Jack knew they would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. He couldn't afford to underestimate them. As they neared the compound, the sound of motorcycles grew faint behind them. Jack's mind raced with possibilities. He had no idea what kind of response the Serpents would send, but he knew it wouldn't be good. "We're almost there," Jack muttered to himself, his eyes scanning the horizon. The sun was barely peeking over the trees when they pulled up to the compound's entrance. The air was still, the silence almost oppressive. Jack parked his bike and quickly dismounted, his boots hitting the gravel with a heavy thud. The others followed suit, their faces grim as they surveyed the area. "This is it," Jack said, turning to the crew. "We make our stand here. No one gets in without a fight." Bear stepped forward, his massive form blocking the entrance as he looked around. "We've got a lot of ground to cover. We need to make sure the perimeter is secure before anything else." Jack nodded in agreement. "Right. We'll set up defenses. Get the lookout posts ready. We need to know if the Serpents are moving." The crew quickly set to work, spreading out to secure the compound. Jamal, still shaken from everything, stood by Jack's side. "You all right, kid?" Jack asked, his voice softer now. Jamal nodded slowly, but there was still a look of fear in his eyes. I don't understand why they're doing this," he said quietly. Jack's gaze softened as he crouched down to the boy's level. "They're not after you, Jamal. They're after us, and we're not letting them take anyone else." Jamal swallowed hard, tried to understand the gravity of the situation. "But what if they come for me again?" Jack placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "They won't get to you. Not while we're here. We've got your back." The weight of those words seemed to give Jamal a sense of comfort, though. His anxiety was still palpable. The bikers continued preparing the compound, setting up lookouts and securing the perimeter. The area was quiet for the moment, but Jack could feel the tension rising in the air. He knew the Serpents wouldn't let them get away with this. They would come, and when they did, Jack would be ready. As the sun began to set, the mood shifted. Jack's gut was telling him that something was coming, that the calm was only temporary. He stood by the entrance, scanning the horizon, his hand resting on the grip of his weapon. "We need to move fast," he said quietly, his voice low but commanding. "Get everyone inside, secure the doors. The Serpents won't waste time." Bear nodded and turned to the others, giving them the signal to move. The crew quickly filed into the compound, their bikes lined up neatly outside as they took positions around the building. Jack stayed at the entrance, watching. It wasn't long before the distant sound of engines could be heard. Jack's heart skipped a beat as the roar grew louder, the unmistakable sound of motorcycles approaching. "They're here," Jack muttered. "Stay sharp." The others tensed, their eyes narrowing as they prepared for the inevitable confrontation. The sound of engines grew closer, and Jack's grip tightened. "This is it," he said, his voice steady. "We fight. We protect Jamal. We protect each other." The first of the Serpents' motorcycles appeared on the horizon, and Jack's heart raced. The rest of the crew, now in position, was ready. The Serpents were coming fast, and this time, they weren't going to let anything stand in their way. Jack's eyes narrowed as he watched the approaching bikes. There were at least a dozen of them, their engines roaring as they approached. The riders were heavily armed, their tattoos and colors visible in the fading light. "Get ready," Jack said, his voice low and commanding. "We hold the line here. No one gets through." The Serpents circled around the compound, their bikes coming to a stop just outside the entrance. Jack could feel the tension in the air as they dismounted, their eyes locked on him and his crew. "This ends tonight," Jack, the leader of the Serpents, said, stepping forward. His eyes were cold, calculating, and filled with rage. "You've taken what's mine, and I'm not walking away without a fight." Jack stood tall, his expression unwavering. "You should have stayed out of it," he said, his voice steady. "You came after us, and now you'll regret it." The Serpent leader laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "You think you've won? You just made things worse for yourself." Jack didn't flinch. "We'll see about that. As the two sides stood facing each other, the air crackled with tension. The Serpents had made their move, and now it was time for the Thunderwolves to show them what they were made of. The standoff was about to turn into a battle that would decide more than just Jamal's fate. It would decide whether they could survive the war that had just begun. The Serpents stood their ground as the engines of their motorcycles hummed in the background, the low roar sending a chill through the air. Jack stood at the front of his crew, his eyes locked on the leader of the Serpents, whose cold gaze held nothing but contempt. The tension was unbearable, thick in the air, as the bikers waited for the first move. The leader of the Serpents stepped forward, his posture menacing as he looked at Jack with a sneer. "You really think you can stop us?" he said, his voice dripping with venom. Jack didn't flinch, his expression unwavering. "You're not getting through here, not while we're still standing." The Serpent leader's eyes flickered, his lips curling into a smirk. "You don't get it, do you? You think you've won? You've just delayed the inevitable." Jack's hand tightened on the grip of his knife. He knew the Serpents wouldn't back down. The tension was building, the calm before the storm, as both sides prepared for the inevitable clash. "We're not going anywhere," Jack said coldly. "We're not leaving until you're done. And we'll fight to the end if we have to." The Serpent leader scoffed, his eyes flicking to the rest of his crew, signaling them to prepare. The bikers braced themselves, knowing what was coming. Jack could feel the air shift as the Serpents moved in closer. They were outnumbered, but that didn't matter. They had the advantage of loyalty, of family, something the Serpents couldn't understand. "You want to do this the hard way?" Jack said, his voice low, barely above a whisper. The Serpent leader's smirk faltered as he took a step back. "No," he said, his voice cold and bitter. "You've just signed your own death warrants." The sound of the Serpents drawing weapons filled the air, and in an instant, chaos erupted. The bikers dove into action, their movements fluid and coordinated. Jack moved quickly, his instincts taking over as he parried an incoming strike from one of the Serpents. He dodged, his movements sharp and precise, his knife slicing through the air. The battle had begun. Bear was beside him in an instant, taking on two of the Serpents at once, his massive frame a wall of power as he knocked them down one by one. The other bikers fought fiercely, their determination evident in every move they made. The Serpents were ruthless, but they were no match for the Thunderwolves' unity and strength. Jack fought his way through the chaos, his eyes never leaving the Serpent leader. The man was good, but Jack was better. As the fight raged on, Jack finally saw his opening. The Serpent leader lunged, his weapon raised high, but Jack was faster. In one swift motion, he disarmed the man, knocking his weapon from his hand and slamming him against the ground. The Serpent leader gasped for breath, his eyes wide with shock. Jack stood over him, his weapon at the ready. "You're done," Jack said, his voice cold and final. The Serpent leader's sneer disappeared as he realized his defeat. "You think you've won?" he spat, his face twisted with rage. "This isn't over, Jack. We'll be back. You'll regret this." Jack didn't answer. He didn't need to. He knew this wasn't the end. But for now, they had won. The Serpents were defeated, and Jamal was safe. As Jack looked around, he saw his crew standing tall, their faces grim but determined. The fight had been hard, but they had fought together, and that was all that mattered. "We've won today," Jack said, his voice steady. "But we're not done yet. The Serpents won't stop. We'll keep fighting." The bikers nodded in agreement. They knew the battle was far from over. The Serpents would come again, but the Thunderwolves would be ready. Jack turned to Jamal, who was standing beside him, his face still pale, but a little less fearful. "You're safe now, kid," Jack said, his voice softening. Jamal nodded, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Jack placed a hand on his shoulder. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "We protect our own. That's what we do." As the bikers mounted their bikes and prepared to leave, Jack's mind was already working on their next move. The Serpents weren't done, and the Thunderwolves would be ready to face whatever came next. The engines roared to life once again, and the convoy moved forward, their determination unshaken. Jack knew that the road ahead would be dangerous, but as long as they were together, they would always have a fighting chance. The bikes rolled down the road with the engines still humming in the early morning light. The convoy moved at a steady pace, but the sense of urgency was palpable. Jack kept his focus on the road ahead, though his mind was far from settled. The Serpents were relentless, and Jack knew they wouldn't stop until they had exacted some form of revenge. The last battle had been hard, but it had only been a taste of what was coming. He glanced over at Jamal, who was riding beside him, still silent, but there was a glimmer of trust in the boy's eyes. The world they were now caught in was no longer a place of safety, and Jamal had witnessed firsthand the lengths people would go to when it came to family and power. Jack could see it in his face, the loss, the fear, but there was also something else there now, something Jack hadn't seen before: strength. They reached the outskirts of a quiet town. The winding roads, the narrow alleyways, and the old brick buildings reminded Jack of places from his past, places he had ridden through in his younger days. But today, everything felt different. It was as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. "We'll make a quick stop here," Jack said over the intercom, his voice calm but firm. "Stay close. We don't know who's watching." Bear, riding at the back of the convoy, signaled his approval, and the others followed suit. They parked in an alleyway, hidden from the main street, but still close enough to get a feel for the situation. Jack signaled to the crew to stay alert as they dismounted. "We'll keep a low profile," Jack said, keeping his voice low as he turned. To Bear, "We need to find out if the Serpents are still in town, or if they've moved on." Bear nodded. "I'll check out the local hangouts. Keep it quiet. We don't need to draw attention." Jack turned to Jamal. The boy was still looking around nervously, his hands fidgeting with the strap of his jacket. "You okay, Jamal?" Jack asked, his tone gentle, though his eyes remained scanning the area. Jamal nodded, though it was clear he was still processing everything. I don't understand why they won't leave us alone," he muttered, his voice trembling slightly. Jack took a deep breath, his gaze softening. "The Serpents are like a disease, kid. They latch onto people and never let go. But we've got each other. That's what matters." Jamal nodded again, but the doubt in his eyes didn't fade. Jack knew that the boy was going to need more time to heal, but there was no time to waste. They had to keep moving forward. "All right, we're staying here for a bit. Everyone keep your eyes open. If anything feels off, we move." The bikers spread out in pairs, keeping a watchful eye on the surroundings as they set up a small base of operations. Jack stayed close to Jamal, his attention divided between the boy and the situation unfolding around them. Bear returned a few minutes later, his expression serious. "They're still here. A couple of the Serpents are holed up in the old warehouse down the road. Looks like they're laying low, but they're not leaving." Jack's jaw tightened. He had hoped for more time, but it seemed the Serpents were already making their next move. "We can't stay here too long," Jack said, his voice firm. "We'll go in, gather information, and get out. No fights unless we have to." "You think they'll take the bait?" Bear asked, his eyebrows raised in doubt. "They've been after us for a while now," Jack replied. "If they see us as a threat, they'll come for us. But we'll be ready." The group geared up, checking their weapons and making sure everything was in order. As they prepared to leave, Jack turned to Jamal one last time. "Stay close, kid," he said, his voice soft but commanding. "I'm not letting anything happen to you." Jamal met his eyes, and for the first time in a while, Jack saw a flicker of confidence in the boy. "I know," Jamal said quietly, his voice steady. Jack nodded, proud of the boy's resolve. "Let's move." The convoy rolled out, their engines roaring to life as they made their way to the warehouse where the Serpents were hiding. Jack's heart was steady, but his mind raced with thoughts of what could go wrong. The Serpents had already proven they were dangerous, and Jack wasn't about to take any chances. As they approached the warehouse, Jack slowed his bike, signaling the others to do the same. They stopped just out of sight, their bikes lined up neatly in the shadows. The air was thick with tension as they dismounted, each biker moving quietly and cautiously. Jack led the way, his eyes scanning the area for any signs of danger. The warehouse loomed ahead, its broken windows and rusted metal giving it a menacing look. Jack's instincts told him to be careful. This wasn't a place to rush in. The bikers moved in formation, keeping to the shadows, their eyes constantly scanning the surroundings. Jack's heart beat faster as they neared the door of the warehouse. He knew they were close to uncovering the next step in the Serpents' plan, but he also knew the danger they faced was growing by the minute. They were walking into enemy territory, and the only thing standing between them and the Serpents was their resolve and their loyalty to each other. Jack took a deep breath, steadying himself. "We stay together. We move quickly. No hesitation." The door to the warehouse creaked open, and they slipped inside, the darkness swallowing them whole. Every step they took brought them closer to the answers they needed, but also closer to the danger that was waiting for them inside. The darkness of the warehouse closed in around them as Jack and his crew stepped quietly through the shadows. The air was heavy with dust and the smell of old metal. The faint creaking of rusted beams above them, the only sound besides the soft scuffing of boots on concrete. Every biker moved in silence, their eyes scanning the dimly lit interior for any sign of movement. Jack's heart pounded in his chest, not from fear, but from the anticipation of what they might find inside. The Serpents were close, and he knew they had to act fast. "Stay tight," Jack whispered. Into his radio, his voice barely audible. "We stick together. Keep an eye out for anything suspicious. No one goes off alone." Bear, Phantom, and the others nodded in silent agreement, their expressions hard and focused. They knew the stakes were high, and there was no room for error. They made their way deeper into the warehouse, the only light coming from flickering overhead bulbs that cast long, eerie shadows on the walls. Jack's mind raced. The Serpents were known for their brutality, and if they had Jamal in here, it wouldn't be easy getting him out. But Jack had made a promise, and he wasn't about to break it. As they reached a corner of the warehouse, Jack motioned for the group to stop. Ahead of them, in the farthest part of the building, there was movement. The unmistakable sound of voices, muffled but growing louder. Jack crouched low, signaling for the others to do the same. Slowly, they crept forward, their senses heightened, ready for whatever came next. Jack's thoughts were interrupted when Bear tapped him on the shoulder, signaling that he had spotted something. Jack's eyes followed Bear's gaze to a small door at the far end of the warehouse. The door was slightly ajar, and through the crack, Jack could see the dim outline of several figures. The Serpents. They were here. "We've got them," Jack muttered under his breath. "They've got him, too." The realization hit Jack like a ton of bricks. They weren't just dealing with the Serpents. They were dealing with a bigger problem. Jamal was still out there, but so were the rest of the gang. Jack signaled to Bear to take the left, while he and Phantom would flank the right. They would surround the room, give the Serpents no way out. "On three," Jack whispered. "1, 2, 3. The bikers moved like shadows, quickly and silently, their footsteps almost imperceptible as they spread out. Jack and Phantom moved into position, their backs against the cold, concrete wall of the warehouse. Jack's eyes were fixed on the door, watching the Serpents' every move. The voices were clearer now, angry and frustrated. "We should have just taken them out when we had the chance," one of the Serpents growled. "It's too late for that," another voice responded. "We need to keep moving. The plan is still in motion." Jack's eyes narrowed as he heard the words. The plan is still in motion. They had something bigger in mind. This wasn't just about Jamal anymore. Jack didn't hesitate. He motioned to Phantom, who was already making his move. With a burst of speed, Jack rushed to the door, kicking it open with a loud crash. Inside, the Serpents jumped to their feet, shocked by the sudden intrusion. But it was too late. The bikers were already on top of them. Jack's eyes locked onto the man who had been speaking, the Serpent leader. The man's face twisted in anger as he reached for his weapon, but Jack was faster. In one smooth motion, he tackled the man to the ground, pinning him there. "You've got nowhere to run," Jack said, his voice cold. "You're done." The Serpent leader's face turned red with rage, but he didn't fight back. He knew the game was up. "You think you've won?" He spat, his breath coming in sharp gasps. "You have no idea what's coming. This isn't over. Not by a long shot." Jack pressed harder on his chest, silencing him. "We'll see about that," Jack replied, his voice low and unwavering. The rest of the Serpents were quickly subdued by the bikers, their weapons disarmed and their movements restricted. It was over for now. Jack stood up, his eyes scanning the room. There, in the corner, was Jamal. The boy was sitting on the floor, his wrists bound, his eyes wide with fear. Jack's heart sank, but he quickly moved toward him, kneeling in front of the boy. "You're okay now," Jack said, his voice soft but firm. "We've got you. Let's get you out of here." Jamal looked up at him, tears welling in his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered. I thought I was going to die." Jack shook his head. "Not on my watch." He cut the ropes, binding Jamal's wrists, gently helping him to his feet. Bear stepped forward, his face hard but relieved. "Is he okay?" Bear asked, glancing at Jamal. "He's safe," Jack replied, his hand resting on Jamal's shoulder. "We're getting out of here." As they made their way to the door, Jack's mind was already racing again. This wasn't over. The Serpents would regroup. They'd be back, and they would bring more. But Jack wasn't afraid. The Thunder Wolves were family, and they would stand strong together. They had won this battle, but the war was far from over. The atmosphere inside the compound had changed. The battle with the Serpents was over, but the sense of urgency still hung in the air. Jack stood at the front, watching as his crew secured the perimeter once again. The warehouse they had just cleared was now silent, but Jack knew that the Serpents wouldn't stay down for long. Jamal was sitting quietly in the corner, looking more at ease than he had in the past few days, but Jack could see the tension in his young face. He had witnessed far too much. Jack's promise to keep him safe was one he intended to keep, but it wasn't just about protecting the kid from the Serpents. It was about giving him a future beyond the chaos that had surrounded him. Jack turned toward Bear, who was standing by the window, keeping watch. "You think they'll come back tonight?" Jack asked, his voice calm, but filled with an unspoken concern. Bear nodded, his gaze still fixed on the street outside. "We can't rule it out. They're not the type to walk away quietly." Jack ran a hand through his hair, frustration building inside him. They had done everything right. They had protected Jamal, fought off the Serpents, and now they were here, safe for the moment. But something told him this wasn't the end. "We need to be ready," Jack said, turning back to his crew. "We've got a small window of time before they make their next move. We need to figure out where they're coming from, and we need to hit them first. No waiting around." The bikers gathered around, their faces set in determination. They knew what needed to be done. They had survived the first assault, but the war with the Serpents was far from over. As Jack spoke with the crew, Jamal stood up and approached him slowly. His steps were tentative, but his voice was steady. "I don't want to be a burden to you guys," Jamal said quietly, looking down at the floor. "I just want to go home." Jack softened his expression, kneeling down to meet Jamal's eyes. "Kid, you're not a burden. You're family now. We're going to get you back to a place where you can live without worrying about looking over your shoulder. But right now, you're safer with us. And we'll do everything we can to keep it that way." Jamal nodded slowly, the weight of the situation still heavy on his young shoulders. He wasn't just a victim. He was learning the strength of those who were willing to fight for him. "I trust you," he whispered, his voice tinged with uncertainty but growing confidence. Jack placed a hand on his shoulder, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "That's all I need to hear, kid. We've got this." The crew spent the next few hours fortifying their position. They set up watch posts and secured every possible exit. Jack's mind, however, never stopped working. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. They had already crossed paths with the Serpents, and they knew the gang wouldn't just back off. The fight was personal now. Jack checked his watch. It was nearly midnight. "Everyone stay sharp," Jack said to his crew, his voice filled with quiet authority. "If they make a move, we'll be ready." The night dragged on, the tension building with each passing hour. Jack paced near the entrance, his mind running through every possible scenario. They needed more information about the Serpents' plans, but they also couldn't afford to wait. Every moment counted. Bear stepped over to Jack, his voice low. "We've got movement. A few cars just pulled up outside. Looks like they're making their move." Jack's pulse quickened. "Are they alone?" Bear shook his head. "There's a lot of them, Jack. They brought backup. This isn't just a quick strike. They're ready for war." Jack clenched his fists, his mind racing. They had to act fast, or they would be overwhelmed. Get everyone into position. We'll make our stand here. No one gets past us. The bikers moved quickly, taking their positions with precision. Jack felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. It wasn't just his life on the line anymore. It was Jamal's, his crew's, everyone who had placed their trust in him. The sound of engines revving outside the compound grew louder. Jack's grip tightened on his weapon. The Serpents had come, and they weren't going to stop until they got what they wanted. "Stay calm," Jack said to the crew, his voice steady. "We've been through worse. We stand together, and we win." As the first of the Serpents bikers appeared at the compound's entrance, the rest of the crew stood ready. The fight was about to begin, but Jack knew they had the strength to come out on top. The Thunder Wolves were united, and that unity was their greatest weapon. "This is our home now," Jack muttered to himself, "and no one's taking it from us." With that, the first shot was fired, and the battle for survival began once again. The sound of heavy engines filled the night air as the Serpents closed in on the compound. Jack stood at the front of his crew, his grip firm on his weapon, every muscle in his body tense with anticipation. The Thunder Wolves had already proven themselves once, but this time, it was different. The Serpents weren't just looking for a fight. They were coming for revenge, and they weren't going to leave without making a statement. Jack's eyes scanned the area, his instincts on high alert as the bikers got into position. "Stay sharp," Jack said, his voice low but steady. "We've been through this before, but this time, we make sure they don't get back up." The others nodded, their faces set with determination. They had fought hard to get Jamal to safety, and now it was time to protect what was theirs. The Serpents were coming, and they wouldn't take this compound without a fight. The first wave of Serpents rolled up to the compound's gates, their motorcycles lining up in front, engines revving as if to announce their arrival. Jack felt the air grow thick with tension, the silence broken only by the sound of the bikes. "Here they come," Bear muttered, stepping up beside Jack, his eyes scanning the area. "Looks like they brought everything they've got." Jack nodded, his jaw tightening. "This is it. No more running. We hold this ground." The bikers got into position, their eyes narrowed, their weapons ready. Jack could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, but he stood tall. He couldn't afford to show weakness, not now. The Serpents had underestimated them once, and they weren't going to make that mistake again. The leader of the Serpents, a tall, imposing figure with a skull tattoo on his neck, stepped forward, his eyes locked onto Jack. "You're still standing?" the Serpent leader sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "Did you think we'd just let you walk away?" Jack met his gaze, his voice steady. "You're not walking away, and neither are we." The Serpent leader laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You've cost us a lot, Jack, but this time, you're not going to escape." "We don't plan on escaping," Jack said, his voice cold. "We're standing our ground. You want to fight? You've got one." The Serpent leader's expression darkened, his fists clenching. "You're making a big mistake." With a swift motion, the Serpent leader raised his hand, signaling his men to move in. The bikers fired first, the sound of gunshots and revving engines filling the air as the battle erupted. Jack was in the thick of it, his movements fluid as he dodged attacks and struck back. His knife was in his hand, slicing through the air with precision as he took down one Serpent after another. The Serpents fought back fiercely, but the Thunder Wolves were relentless, their loyalty to each other and their determination to protect Jamal driving them forward. The fight raged on, the air thick with the sounds of battle. Jack moved quickly, his instincts taking over as he fought alongside Bear and the others. They were a well-oiled machine, their coordination flawless as they pushed the Serpents back. But even as they gained ground, Jack knew this wasn't over. The Serpents would keep coming, but they had one advantage: unity. As the battle continued, Jack's eyes scanned the area, searching for any signs of weakness. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw a flash of movement. The Serpent leader was coming at him again, his eyes wild with fury. Jack didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, tackling the man to the ground. The two rolled, fighting for control, but Jack was stronger. With a quick motion, he pinned the leader to the ground, his knife at the man's throat. "It's over," Jack said, his voice calm but firm. The serpent leader struggled beneath him, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "You think you've won?" he spat, his face twisted with rage. "You've just delayed the inevitable. The serpents will never stop coming for you." Jack's grip tightened on the knife, his eyes never leaving the leader's face. "This ends now," Jack said, his voice cold. "You're done." The serpent leader's eyes flickered with a mixture of rage and fear, but he knew it was over. Jack stood up, wiping the blood from his hands. As he surveyed the battlefield, the Thunderwolves had won, but at a cost. The Serpents had been defeated for now, but Jack knew this wasn't the last time they would come after them. He turned to Jamal, who was standing off to the side, watching the chaos unfold. The boy's face was pale, but there was a look of quiet resolve in his eyes. "You all right, kid?" Jack asked, his voice softer now. Jamal nodded, though he still looked shaken. "I'm okay. Just glad it's over." Jack smiled, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "It's not over yet," he said, "but we've got this. As long as we're together, we'll always have a fighting chance." The bikers gathered together, their faces grim but resolute. The Serpents may have been pushed back, but the battle was far from over. Jack knew they would be ready, no matter what came next. They had each other, and that was all they needed to survive. The night was still, the sound of engines now nothing more than a distant memory as Jack stood outside the compound, looking at the aftermath of the battle. The Serpents had been dealt with for now, but Jack knew the war wasn't over. There would be more fights, more threats, and he had no illusions about how far the Serpents would go to make them pay for standing in their way. But tonight they had won, and that had to be enough. Jack turned to his crew, his eyes scanning their tired faces. Some were bruised, some were bleeding, but they were all alive, and that was a victory in itself. "We hold the line," Jack said, his voice steady. "We don't let them take us down. We keep moving forward, one step at a time." Bear stepped forward, wiping blood from his hands. "You know this isn't the end, right?" Jack nodded, his expression hardening. "I know, but for tonight, we've made our stand, and that's all we can do." Jamal, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, stood up slowly, walking over to Jack. His eyes were filled with a mix of gratitude and confusion. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice softer than before. Jack looked down at him, his heart heavy. "Now, we make sure you're safe. We'll get you back to your family, away from all this. You don't need to be a part of this fight." Jamal shook his head, a determined look on his face. "I can't go back to the way things were. I don't want to just hide and hope they forget about me." Jack's expression softened. He had seen that look before. It was the look of someone who had been through hell and come out the other side, someone who had learned the hard way that running was never the answer. "You don't have to fight alone," Jack said, his voice firm. "You've got us now. We're a family, and we take care of our own." Jamal nodded, the faintest smile tugging at his lips. "I'm ready to fight with you." Jack placed a hand on his shoulder, offering a small but genuine smile. "We'll make sure you're ready, but we won't make you do this alone. You're not just a kid. You're one of us now." With that, the group gathered their things and began to prepare for the next phase of the battle. They knew the Serpents would return, but Jack was ready. They had fought hard for Jamal's safety, but there were bigger things at stake now. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for their lives, for each other, and for everything they believed in. As the bikers made their way toward the exit, Jack looked back one last time at the compound. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but as long as they stuck together, they could face anything. They had already been through hell, and they had come out stronger because of it. "Let's go," Jack said, his voice low but filled with determination. "We've got a future to protect." And with that, the Thunderwolves rode out into the night, ready for whatever came next. The battle was far from over, but Jack knew one thing for sure. They were ready for it. Together, they could take on anything, and as long as they had each other, they would never back down.